Hocus pocus Satan! Hi friends, it's almost the spooky time, and as someone who's seen way too many movies, I thought I'd recommend you some films from my favorite subgenre, the horror comedy. It's an idea I've been bouncing around a while. I've seen far too many movies, so I'd love to recommend some underseen and underrated ones to you. And with Halloween right around the corner, I'd love to talk about horror comedies, which I love to death. Horror comedy is honestly one of my favorite subgenres. I think partially just because I have a really dark sense of humor, as well as just kind of finding horror movies more fun than anything else. And what's more fun than a comedy horror? Additionally, I think it's kind of difficult to pull off a film that is wholly comedic and yet still kinda scary. That said, it's kind of hard to recommend underrated and underseen ones when your average man on the street doesn't watch any horror comedy. So, just as a brief preface, here are what I consider the essential horror comedies. Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, The Evil Dead Trilogy, Reanimator, Rocky Horror, Young Frankenstein, Cabin in the Woods, Scream, Shaun of the Dead, Gremlins and Gremlins 2, and The Toxic Avenger. Those are just what I consider the essentials. It doesn't include films like The Howling and Tremors, which are also worth your time. Although weirdly, my original list included What We Do in the Shadows, which I think has shot up in popularity since I added it to the list. Enough that I'm not going to talk about it here, but you should also check that one out. And with that, let's get right into the list. And I'm going to start with one I have already kind of talked about, Friday the 13th, Part 6, Jason Lives. You might remember last year when Paul and I watched all the Friday the 13th and Halloween movies. Don't worry, we'll be back with the new Halloween movie coming out this month. And this was one that we pointed to as actually being pretty good. It's a total self-aware farce of the Friday the 13th series. Intentionally funny, unlike Part 4, which I think was just ironically funny. I mean, the movie starts with a goddamn James Bond parody. You can't expect it to be that serious. There's all sorts of goofy scenes in this movie. There's a scene of some campers that are very obviously going to die. And to emphasize the point, they put on headbands that just say dead. I don't know, I've talked about this before. You can go watch that video. I recommend this one out of all the Friday the 13th movies. And speaking of Friday the 13th, let's move on to a film produced by Friday the 13th director Sean Cunningham, House, and its sequel, House 2, The Second Story. Not to be confused with the Japanese film House. House is very Evil Dead 2-esque to me. Certainly it's not as well made or high energy, but it's got that same sort of insane feeling to it. The monsters do kind of remind me of Evil Dead 2 villains, just less scary. Ultimately, this whole film feels like a comedic version of Jacob's Ladder. Another underrated horror film to be sure, but by no means a comedy. The weird thing is, this came out 5 years before Jacob's Ladder, and I have to wonder if the guy who wrote Jacob's Ladder didn't see House and went, this would be better if it was played straight. Still, House is a very funny and also kind of scary movie. The film's about a man named Roger, played by the greatest American hero, William Catt, who inherits a house from his aunt who recently committed suicide. Roger fought in the Vietnam War and is currently experiencing PTSD, so when strange things start happening in the house, he's unsure if it's him going crazy or if the house is actually haunted. Which sounds like maybe a bad concept for a comedy, but it is genuinely funny in a lot of places, on top of being genuinely scary. Now, its sequel, House 2, which is not a direct follow-up, it's more a spiritual successor, plays it a lot more comedic. This is about two guys who end up resurrecting one of their ancestors and filling their whole house with ghosts. This one's just off-the-wall crazy. If you want the funnier of the two, it's this one. Although if you're looking for a more well-made film, House 1 is definitely that. I don't know, I just consider both of these films to be very funny and very scary. And moving right along, let's talk about the Japanese film Houseu, also called House in the US. Yeah, I'm recommending both horror comedies named House. So if you see a film called House, pick it up. The only way you could really screw that up is if you get the Will Ferrell comedy, The House. Or I guess you could pick up the TV show House, but that's kind of a hard mistake to make. That's not a horror comedy movie. Anyways, Houseu is a crazy Japanese horror parody film. It came out in '77, and yet it does a very good job lampooning horror cliches that were very, very new at the time. They aren't cliches like we think of them now. And I mean, it's a satire down to the fact that all of the girls' names are just their singular character trait. They don't even have real names. And again, kind of like Evil Dead 2, a lot of the horror in this film comes from how bizarre and high energy the film is. You really have no clue what's about to happen, and that is kind of terrifying and also very silly. It is a surrealist masterpiece, to say the least. The film's about some girls who go out to one of their aunt's place, and I think she's a witch or something. It's not totally clear. And a bunch of them end up dying, and just weird things happen the whole time. I don't know how much more I could say about this. I mean, it's the very essence of what the fuck Japan. So I say we go ahead and move on to another Friday the 13th tangential film, Behind the Mask, Rise of Leslie Vernon, which supposedly takes place in the same universe as Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street, and Halloween. It probably helps its case that it features Robert Englund, and I think was produced by Kane Hodder. I can't say that with total certainty. The film takes place in this slasher movie universe, and is about a documentary crew following around this guy, Leslie Vernon, who hopes to be the next great slasher villain. It's hard to call it a mockumentary because it sort of abandons being a documentary somewhere around the third act. Though to be fair, that would be about where Leslie's horror film would start. So maybe you can look at it as a mockumentary leading into the slasher film they've been building up the whole movie. My one gripe with this movie is there's some weird reveals in the third act that aren't really clarified. I've heard whispers of a sequel to this film, and I would love to see that, but it's been more than 10 years. I don't think we're getting that follow-up. Still, though, I think it's a very funny movie. Not only mocks a lot of the cliches of slasher movies like we're used to, but it kind of analyzes them in I hate to say a deeper context, but perhaps a faux deeper context, for the sake of comedy. It also manages to have some genuine surprises in the third act, and I think it's kind of funny. And moving right along to yet another slasher parody, Dude Bro Party Massacre 3. The title says it all, I don't even know what to say. Rather than lampooning the specific cliches of the genre, Dude Bro Party Massacre 3 seeks to take them to the very extreme. Maybe not the film to watch if you don't like gore, though to be fair, it's such ludicrous gore, it surpasses actually being disgusting, and it's just really funny. It's like Kill Bill levels of gore. The film, I believe, was made by some YouTubers, 5-second films, and features some great performances from people like Greg Sestero from The Room, Andrew W.K., and Patton Oswalt, so there's that. And it's just non-stop, wall-to-wall, ridiculous killing. It is a laugh riot. I don't know if you can get this film physically, but it is out there digitally, and I highly recommend you look at that. Moving on to another recent film, we have 2014's Wolfcop. Now, these blank cop movies are a dime a dozen, and a lot of them are not very interesting. Wolfcop I was particularly wary of, because it seems to be jumping on the so bad it's good movie bandwagon that so many studios fail at doing. What I was surprised to find was that Wolfcop actually has a pretty coherent plot. I mean, it's nothing brilliant, but there's an actual mystery there, which is more than I was expecting from a movie called Wolfcop. It also does go all out insane. It's not just playing around like, haha, it's Wolfcop, that's the only joke we have. It really does push it to the extremes. It's kind of Trauma-esque in its approach to humor. Trauma, surprisingly, not featured on this list. It's just an all-out insane movie, and one of the best blank cop movies, right alongside the obvious RoboCop and the hilariously titled Violent Cop. The film follows Lou Garou, a lazy police officer in a small town who's constantly getting in trouble for slacking on his job after the mayor is murdered and he mysteriously gets werewolf powers. He tries to track down the mayor's killers as well as the origins of his werewolfism, leading him to this secret cult that's been going on in the city. I think I'm going to stop there because I don't want to give too much away. Again, there's way more plot there than I would expect from a movie called Wolfcop. I know, super unprofessional of me to interrupt myself, but I forgot to tell you guys about Murder Party, even though I wrote it down on the list. Matt, how did you miss that? You complete fuck up. Get your life together. I'm sorry, babe. You know I love you. Jesus Christ. They installed a new AC unit, and it is loud as fuck, and I cannot turn it off. Anyways, Murder Party, from the writer-director of the 2016 hit Green Room. I don't know, it kind of seems like if you keep up with horror movies, you heard about Green Room, but if you're out of the loop, you might have missed it. So if you're looking for a horror movie, that's a good one to check out, although much like Jacob's Ladder, by no means a comedy. Murder Party, on the other hand, is very much a comedy. So much so, I might not even call it a horror comedy. It might go just far enough to be a dark comedy, but it takes place on Halloween, so, you know, appropriate for the season. The story follows a character named Christopher, a very lonely man, who finds an invitation to something called a murder party, and since he has nothing better to do on Halloween, he decides to go find out what it is. And it is exactly what you think it is. It's just a bunch of people trying to murder him. And that's the movie. It's a bunch of people trying to murder this guy, and him trying not to get murdered. And it's a comedy, and it's really funny. See, the people trying to kill him are all very funny, interesting characters. Some of them are outright insane, some of them think they're doing it for a reason, and it's this very interesting clash of dynamics, and a lot of the humor is derived from the murderers arguing with each other about how they're going to murder him. Like, if these people could get on the same page, the movie would be over in like 20 minutes. This movie, I think, was just recently added to Netflix, so, you know, right in time for Halloween. I'd highly recommend you check it out. Also, as long as I'm interrupting myself, I feel kind of bad for not saying Ghostbusters is one of the essential horror comedies. I guess partially because I don't consider it totally a horror movie. Also, it's Ghostbusters. You don't need me to tell you to go watch it. You've seen Ghostbusters. Anyways, back to our regularly scheduled programming. Next, there's Deathgasm, a film I really don't want to talk about because I'm working on a list of the most metal movies for Metalween, and this is going to be on it, so I'd rather just talk about it then. But if you're looking for some recommendations and want to get in on this before I talk about it, there it is. It's called Deathgasm. It's about a metal band. I mentioned it briefly at the end of my Trick or Treat review, because it's kind of a parody of Trick or Treat. Stylistically, it reminds me a lot of Scott Pilgrim, but more metal. And you know, I think I'm just going to leave it at that. and talk about it more next month. Moving on to the last two movies I'd like to talk about. First, there's Hollywood Boulevard from director Joe Dante. I mentioned a few of his movies at the beginning, Gremlins 1 and 2 and The Howling, and I honestly could have put 2 or 3 of his movies in this one. Most notably Piranha, although I think that's a discussion for another day. Hollywood Boulevard, meanwhile, is a film produced by the infamous Roger Corman, directed by Joe Dante, and starring Paul Bartel, who directed plenty of movies for Corman. Honestly, Dante and Bartel, as well as some other people under Corman, kind of pioneered the horror comedy. The film itself kind of lampoons the way Roger Corman would produce movies. There's a very obvious Corman Studios stand-in. All the movies they make are very obviously based on other Corman movies, which, granted, kind of served as an excuse to just reuse footage from Corman's old movies. But I think there's enough here that I genuinely enjoy it. The story is about a young actress who gets work on this very cheap production, and finds that a lot of the other young actresses are mysteriously dying. And so there's kind of a murder mystery going on. Meanwhile, they just kind of make a lot of jokes about how cheap Corman's productions are. Now, if that plot sounds familiar to longtime viewers, it's because it's the plot to Ginger Dead Man 2. I give Ginger Dead Man 2 a little credit for that joke, but no, they stole it from this movie. And you know what? They're not even the only ones to steal it from this movie. Troma, a company I have praised in the past, also redid this idea in their film Terror Firmer. Now, of the three, Dante's Hollywood Boulevard is by far the best. It's just a lot more focused and less obnoxious than the other two. I should probably throw a content warning out here. There's a kind of tasteless rape joke in this movie, so if that bothers you, maybe skip it. It's very brief, and sadly a product of its time. I wish it wasn't there, but it's easy enough to ignore in the face of how funny the rest of the movie is. So, yeah, apologies for that, but the rest of the movie's good. And I would like to end with yet another Corman movie, one a bit older and one that Corman himself directed, a film called A Bucket of Blood. Do not let the title fool you. This movie is not gory at all. There is not a single bucket of blood in this movie. It was a very common tactic Corman did, where he would come up with the title before making the movie, and in this case, the title really doesn't fit. That said, it is a very funny movie that takes kind of a jab at the postmodern beatnik art movement of the early 60s and kind of still continues today. The film stars Dick Miller as Walter Paisley, a character he would go on to play in several other movies despite dying a few times. For more on that, you can see my video Dante's Looney Inferno over on my Smash Universe channel. In the film, he accidentally kills his neighbor's cat, and to cover that fact up, he covers the cat in clay. And suddenly everyone thinks he's a brilliant artist. This, of course, escalates into him killing other things and covering them in clay to make it seem like he is this artist. Story-wise, it reminds me a lot of Corman's next film, certainly the more popular of the two, Little Shop of Horrors. That, I think, is also a pretty funny horror comedy, and far better than the musical version from the 80s, Don't At Me. But of the two, I think Bucket of Blood is a lot more clever, and it did all those things first. The only real problems with Bucket of Blood are A, the misleading name, and B, just how cheap it is, which you kinda have to expect from a Corman film. The film is also public domain, so it's not that hard to find. It's out there for free. Enjoy it. And I think that's where I'm gonna end it. I hope you all have a great spooky month. I hope you check out some of these films and let me know what you think of them. And until next time, I have been Matt.